Thank you for tuning in to the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this week joining me is Nina Teicholz, who is a journalist known best for her work in the book, The Big Fat Surprise. And this is one of those episodes where if you are new to a ketogenic diet or have any questions about it, you have friends and family that are always asking you, hey, isn't fat bad for you? And in this episode, we unpack all of the reasons why we have this public stigma against fat and kind of where to go and all the science behind why fat is actually really, really good for you. And it's something that when people don't eat it, they're missing out. So this one, I'm sure, is one that you're going to be sharing to all your friends and family who ask you this question. You're going to learn a lot. I did a lot from reading Nina's book. So tune in and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Nina, thank you for being on the show today.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're one of the top people that I wanted to get on this show when I started it, just because of the amount of research that you've done for your book that you released in 2014, The Big Fat Surprise, is overwhelming. And so thank you for doing that work. That was pretty much a tome in the huge explanation, and we can go on for probably hours explaining just a few of the chapters in there. But basically the reason why we have this stigma of fat in our diets and why this is just completely wrong. Do you want to give us just a cliff notes of that beginning story?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that the common view that is now sort of out there in the media is like that it was the sugar industry that shifted the blame to fat, and that was. But really, and that's come out because of a couple of documents that have surfaced that seem to point to that explanation. But, in the almost 10 years of research that I did for this book, reading like every last nutrition science paper, I don't recommend this to the general public, but reading every last nutrition science paper that I could get my hands on, going back to the 1930s, 20s even, my conclusion is that the men especially, these scientists who believe that saturated fat and cholesterol, and then later on fat in general, were bad for health, they truly believe that hypothesis. They were converts to that hypothesis. They proposed it in the 1950s. And that hypothesis that saturated fat and cholesterol in particular cause heart disease is called the diet heart hypothesis. And they really believed it. And when the sugar industry came along with some money saying, please publish this paper or, review the literature on sugar. And they, and these authors, and particularly one, Mark Hegsted from Harvard, sort of downplayed the effect of sugar. But, he was already a saturated fat convert in believing that that was the dietary demon. So if any industry played an outsized role, in my view, at least from my research, it was actually the vegetable oil industry, because they were they're the ones who gained the most, right? They paid for so much of the early research. They were involved in nearly all the early research, trying to shift the blame on saturated fats, because who benefits when you don't eat saturated fats? Unsaturated fats. And that's the vegetable industry. So I write a lot about them in my book.
Right. But, so what caused these guys in the meeting to be so adamant that their point of view on saturated fats causing heart disease was the right one?
Well, partly it has to do with the fact that Ansel Keys, a pathologist from University of Minnesota, was he was just a particular kind of man. He had an unshakable faith in his own beliefs. He was extremely charismatic. He could argue anyone to the death. He was called a bully even by his friends. I mean, he was this sort of charismatic leader, and he really had the sort of opposite view that a scientist is taught to have, which a scientist is taught to sort of doubt their own beliefs and to try to prove themselves wrong. That's sort of the scientific mindset that you were taught to have. And instead, Ansel Keys really had this point of view that he was right until proven wrong. So he really pushed his theory, and he was surrounded by a group of scientists, like-minded scientists. And I think the other explanation is that this was in a context of this tremendous vacuum and this sense of public health urgency that existed in the 1950s, because heart disease, which had pretty much been a non-issue in the early 1900s, had risen out of nowhere to be the number one leading cause of death by the 1950s among men. President Eisenhower having a heart attack in 1955 was a seminal moment in U.S. history. So there was this public health emergency. What causes heart disease? And no one knew. So Ansel Keys really stepped into that vacuum with his explanation, and the public health community just sucked it up. And absorbed it and adopted it. National Institutes of Health adopted it because they needed an explanation. It seemed plausible, and they ran with it, really before there was any good science to support that hypothesis.
Right. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but they were using epidemiology to confer causality. And I mean, this might be, again, a huge tangent as well, but can you just explain to people the difference between research study formation types, so like epidemiology versus randomized controlled trials, and why some is science and some is not?
Yeah, this is an important topic because it doesn't just explain what happened historically, but this also explains why we are so continually frustrated by the flip-flopping headlines in newspapers today, which is that yes, back in the 1950s, Ansel Keys based his hypothesis on epidemiology, a kind of science that shows association only, but cannot demonstrate cause and effect. So basically, they give people a bunch of food frequency questionnaires, and you're said, like, how many peaches did you eat in the last 6 months? Oh, who knows? But fill in the blank. And then how many pears did you eat in the last 6 months? And what about the lasagna you had last night? How are you going to code that? So that is very, very weak data. And ultimately, it can never prove cause and effect. To show cause and effect, you have to do what's called a controlled clinical trial, which is, what they do for drugs to get a drug approved. You have to have a controlled clinical trial where half the people get a placebo and half the people get the drug, right? And that's the only way you can show cause and effect. And that's considered the gold standard of science. Well, in nutrition, even though they've done randomized controlled clinical trials, our nutrition policy is really still, a lot of it is based on this very weak kind of epidemiological studies, because they are what, they hit the headlines. And because it's such weak science, that is why those studies are always the source of these flip-flopping headlines. And you can the way you know that you're reading a study like that in the newspaper is, this whatever, caffeine may have an effect on da-da-da, or is associated with. When you see those words, just turn the page, because that kind of finding is very weak, and 9 times out of 10 will be reversed when it's actually properly tested in a good clinical trial.
Right. And so basically we're taking surveys, and which is helpful for determining what we want to have as a hypothesis to make randomized controlled trials. Like this is a very good thing. But some of the ridiculous things that I've seen is people actually conferring absurd headlines from this. Like, for instance, you could say that shark attacks are correlated with increased sale of ice cream or something like this. But that doesn't mean that selling ice cream is going to cause shark attacks.
Well, yeah, there's so many, there's wonderful examples of it. Like people with yellow fingers have a higher rate of heart disease. Oh my goodness, do yellow fingers cause heart disease? No, smoking causes heart disease, and people who smoke tend to have yellow fingers. Right. So these are all these problems. There was once an experiment where somebody actually, as a joke, did all these correlations, this kind of weak science on people's horoscopes and whether they were likely to die of certain kinds of diseases. And they made, because you can make correlations out of anything. And it turns out, Leo, if you were Leo, you were more likely to, contract stomach cancer or something. But, you can get a positive correlation out of any data set. And that's why that kind of data, again, as you said, it's really good for suggesting a hypothesis that then needs to be tested in a clinical trial. But,
right.
Until it's tested, it's just a hypothesis. It should not be in the newspaper. It's nothing that any of us should be thinking or worrying about.
Right. And so you said that people were desperate at this time in the 50s to have an answer. Did you, in your research, find any probable causes as to why we were having this emerging heart disease epidemic?
Well, that's an awfully good question, and I think we don't know the answer. I will tell you that the two best explanations that I have are, number one, sugar came into the food supply for human beings in the late 1700s when it started to be refined in the Caribbean islands, and the first cases of heart disease appear in the late 1700s in Europe when they started exporting sugar in those. So the increased consumption of sugar is one, I think, plausible possible explanation. And there's really quite a rigorous record about heart disease. I mean, people always say, "Oh, we had heart disease, but we didn't recognize it." But actually, if you go back and look at the record, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of history written about all kinds of all kinds of medical conditions like gout and headaches and all these things. People wrote thousands of pages on these for, going back to thousands of years, but not heart disease. So we're fairly sure that heart disease, chest pain, heart attacks, that those really did not become common until the late were not even observed really until the late 1700s. Another possible cause of heart disease, I think, may aggravate it, is vegetable oils. So vegetable oils introduced into the U.S. food supply in 1911 really had not, in the form of Crisco originally, just had been used for machine lubricants, but had not been a foodstuff. This is oils pressed from soybeans, cottonseed, corn. There just hadn't been the machinery to press oil out of these beans and seeds until for human purposes until the early 1900s. And then if you look at the rise in heart disease, it perfectly parallels the rise in vegetable oil consumption in the U.S. So, and now we know that vegetable oil, especially when it's heated, has rather large inflammatory effects. Inflammation, something that leads to heart disease. So I think there's a really plausible link there between vegetable oils and heart disease as well.
Right. And so people who aren't familiar with what you're talking about, maybe vegetable oils, they just hear, oh, that's a fat. I think that's healthy. I've heard that things like canola oil are healthy, heart healthy. Can we just break down for a second just saturated versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated? And then we can have maybe a more clear understanding of kind of where we got wrong and flip the switch on saturated to polyunsaturated?
Yeah. So, my whole book, really the central argument in my whole book is that saturated fats were unfairly convicted for causing heart disease. And saturated fats are found in meat and dairy, but also coconut oil, palm oil. And one thing that's super important to understand is that all foods contain a mixture of fatty acids, right? So yes, red meat has saturated fats in it, but your average porterhouse steak, only 30% of the fats in that steak are fat saturated. Another third are the kind of fat that you have in olive oil. So, foods are not just one monolithic fat.
Right.
So that's important to understand. So saturated fats, saturated refers to the fact that the whole molecule is saturated with hydrogen. There's no double bonds that can open up and react with oxygen. That's a really important thing to understand, just because when you're reacting with oxygen, that's oxidation, right? Remember, we have why do we take antioxidants? Because oxidation is a bad thing. Oxidation leads to inflammation. So saturated fats can't oxidize because they are saturated with hydrogen. So that's so compare those with unsaturated fats. That means they have double bonds that can react with oxygen. Monounsaturated fats have only one double bond. That's olive oil, basically, oleic acid. Olive oil is mostly this monounsaturated fat. And then there are polyunsaturated fats. Soybean oil is the most common one in America, canola oil, corn oil. They have multiple double bonds. That means they have many chances those bonds to open up and react with oxygen. That means they're highly susceptible to oxidation, especially when heated, like frying stuff in those oils. And that leads to inflammation. And that's why those oils, even though we're told to eat them over saturated fats, actually, I think that science really strongly supports the reverse idea. So in other words, the good fats are bad and the bad fats are good.
Right. And if you look at how these things are made too, I mean, you have like a pre-extraction step, you have extraction with solvents, which removes anything that could be good in the plant to begin with. There's a little, nice little tune there, no problem. I mean, we have like semi-refining, which is bleaching it and neutralizing it and removing it of waxes and all this other gum stuff. And then you have deodorizing, which creates an enormous amount of trans fats. And then we add stuff back in so it doesn't get rancid, but that stuff that we add to make it not rancid makes it more damaging in itself. So like the processing steps that you need to do here, and like you said, the machinery just did not exist before a certain time. Like humans would have never gotten these types of foods. So you said that it was for human consumption, but I would say that it still isn't for human consumption. Like if you go give someone, tons of these seeds, there's no way they're going to be able to make an oil out of it at all.
No, I mean, it's a highly industrialized product, right? So as you say, winter, it's, if you press an oil or something out of a seed or a bean, you get gray, bad smelling, odoriferous, like some kind of liquid, and then you have to winterize it, deodorize it, bleach it, treat it with a chemical solvent. I mean, that's like a 15 process step that only happens in a factory. I mean, why are we being told to eat these highly industrial products, margarine or vegetable oils instead of, say, butter? What is the step in producing butter? Milk a cow.
Right.
I mean, it's an absolutely bizarre state of affairs how we've been taught that, and we've somehow come to believe that we should be eating this highly industrialized product, right?
Right.
So, yeah, they're just not natural. They're not naturally occurring. They're not stable. And, one of the things that I discovered from my book is that a lot of the literature, the scientific literature on them had been, I think, more or less suppressed, right? The fact that rats eating vegetable oils, heated vegetable oils, would develop cirrhosis of the liver and die within weeks. And, and what happens when the oils are heated, they develop this shellac-like substance. And that, I mean, it's really scary stories. And I could go on with my scary stories if you want me to, but,
and this is one of the things too, you mentioned that the science was suppressed. People often come to me about some of this stuff in, about a ketogenic diet in particular and saturated fat and all of these things and say, well, why wouldn't the science prove it otherwise? Or why wouldn't my doctor know that now? Like these are pretty big issues where people think that just because we have authority figures or we have this thing called science and research, that it should be proving everything all the time, no matter what. And so I think you made a good point that like some of the stuff, either the funding isn't there to do the research, or it's just published into certain journals, or it is, but they don't release it to the public. Can you go into maybe a little bit about this and how that has since, let's say the saturated fat movement flipped and everybody started supporting that this is the cause of heart disease, everyone was incentivized to keep this rolling, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's just such an important issue because I think it is natural. And I certainly, I was over 25 years a vegetarian and, still have my medical record saying, reduce saturated fat. And all my doctors telling me to cut out meat and cut out saturated fat. And, who are we not to believe that? Right. I mean, I think that we should, in general, I believe in trusting our authorities, who one would hope would have sifted through this evidence. And what happened in this field is exactly what you described, which is that this hypothesis that saturated fat was bad was so widely adopted, including by the National Institutes of Health, so that when they studied it, they understood that Ansel Keys' evidence was this weak epidemiological evidence we talked about, right? So they funded large randomized controlled clinical trials that gold standard of medicine and they funded by the National Institutes of Health. They actually tested, more than 50,000 people on this question: do saturated fats and heart disease and cholesterol cause heart disease? And these studies came out and they could not prove what the government wanted them to prove, because by then the whole US government is recommending this diet, right? So what happens to those studies? Well, and this seems almost impossible to believe, but so the biggest ever study on this, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, on 9,000 men and women in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals where, they really can control their food, right? Because they're in a cafeteria and they're not going out for their food. And it's not like telling somebody, here's a cookbook and try to follow the recipes. or a diet book. It's a highly controlled experiment, and 9,000 men and women were studied on this for 4.5 years, at the end of which they could not find that saturated fats cause heart disease at all. There was no difference in cardiovascular mortality or total mortality for the group that had double the amount of saturated fats. These are the people eating regular meat, regular cheese, butter, compared to people who had eaten margarine, and soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese, those groups. That study did not get published for 16 years. And when they finally published, they put it in this out-of-the-way journal they knew nobody would read. And then when a journalist asked one of the principal investigators, why did you not publish your study, an NIH-funded study, that's considered cheating in science? And he said, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it turned out.
Right, which is bizarre. And you said too, like they published it in a journal that's kind of hidden in the closet that nobody reads. Again, there's so much research always coming out that unless it's in one of these big publications, a lot of people don't find it. Like I have crazy alerts set up because I'm so into this stuff that I get a lot of updates, but still I miss a lot of stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're the American Heart Association or the National Institutes of Health, you know that if there's a study going on that is the largest ever test of one of your key hypotheses, that's not something that you miss or don't understand. You understand that trial didn't come out with the results that were intended and therefore was not published. And then these people also knew that study and 10 other studies have never been reviewed for any of our dietary guidelines. Our all the expert reviews completely ignored these studies. They just wrote them out of the history because they did not confirm what people wanted them to. So they were never grappled with. They were not reviewed. Nobody reckoned with them. And believe me, the American Heart Association knew that these studies were going on. It's their people, their investigators were on these studies. Ansel Keys was one of the principal investigators of this Minnesota coronary survey. He knew it was going on. But what consistently happened was that they could not prove Ansel Keys to be right. They could not show that saturated fats had any effect on cardiovascular mortality at all, ever, in any of these studies. So they just they're what's called silent studies. They don't get included in review papers. They don't get discussed at meetings. Nobody talks about them. It's as if they never happened. Right. This also happened with the largest ever clinical trial in the history of nutrition studies called the Women's Health Initiative on more than 49,000 women who were 8 years on average on the low-fat diet. At the end of that experiment, they could find that cutting out fat, saturated fat, lowering your meat consumption, your dairy, low-fat everything, increasing grains, fruits, and vegetables, those women saw no benefit. They could not they lost no more. Weight loss was not meaningfully greater, no effect for combating type 2 diabetes or heart disease or any kind of cancer.
Right.
And it was powered to be a cancer trial. So that study also never cited, the results have never been cited by any of our authorities in formulating our nutrition recommendations.
Right. And so this is a topic I want to address too, which is when the ball gets rolling so fast and, was it 1980 when when we first got recommendations from the government?
Yes, that was the first dietary guidelines for Americans.
Right. And so if we continue rolling along this trend and then we find that it has no benefit and then potentially that it's making people worse or unhealthy, and that doctors are following this advice and university professors are following this advice and everybody that is an intellectual essentially is following this advice and recommending to other people, it's not easy for humans, in my opinion, to admit that they're wrong. And so when you have to have all these organizations and all these industries be able to be accountable and be like, oh yeah, we were wrong. We lied to everybody and we did really bad science and you're all probably unhealthy for it. That's just not going to happen. And so that's where I think, correct me if I'm wrong here too, but this is where we see American Heart Association last year I don't know if it was last year, coming out with this thing about everyone, we're still right. Coconut oil is probably bad for you.
That was called their Presidential Advisory on Saturated Fats. And it was just sort of doubling down saying, Oh, actually, one of the things it did is it actually reckoned with these clinical trials that I mentioned they had been ignoring for all this time. So they actually looked at those clinical trials. Of course, they did it in a very skewed way that, their review if you compare it to 8 other reviews on this subject, these 8 other reviews find no effect of saturated fat on cardiovascular mortality, but the American Heart Association does. So they have a very skewed view, but it's essentially sort of doubling down and saying, look, we stand by our position. And as you say, it's very hard for people to change their minds. There's the kind of cognitive dissonance involved in that. There's an institutional need to not be flip-flopping on your public, not to lose the public's trust in your organization. There may very well be legal exposure if it turns out you've been recommending a diet that you have maybe knowingly known as no benefit for health. I think there are or in the case of the American Heart Association, they, if you look at their funders list, it's all pharmaceutical companies and food companies who have no interest other than keeping Americans on this model of eating junk food and then then taking a lot of pills.
Right.
That's the model. That's the model. Make Americans sick. I mean, maybe not consciously, but Americans become sick, and then the model is cure them or manage their diseases through pills, not through reversing that disease through nutrition.
Yeah, it's tough. And you say reversing the disease. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff going on. And I think that you pointed out a really good thing that, you said maybe earlier in the 1900s, we had a very tight correlation between the introduction of these vegetable oils and heart disease. And I think that you've also pointed out one with obesity and the nutrition guidelines as well. Do you want to touch on that?
On obesity and the nutrition guidelines. Yeah, well, here's an interesting, I wish I could show this chart to your listeners, but maybe you can post it on your website. But if you look at obesity in America, it's fairly low. And then in 1980, it just shoots up. I mean, it's a really hard turn upwards. And that was the same year that we launched our dietary guidelines for all Americans. And that was the year that all of America got the message loud and clear. You must eat more grains, basically. They put America on a high grain diet, right? It was 5 to 11 or 6 to 11 servings of grain per day, right? Well, so I don't know, I'm not in the business of raising animals, but I know, to get an animal fat, you feed them grain.
Exactly. Yeah, it's insane.
So, here's the policy to fatten Americans. And at the same time, we were told to reduce, eat lean meat or reduce meat, have lean dairy. And, one of the interesting things that I found in my research was that we've long been told that, Americans don't follow the guidelines. That's why we're fat and sick. We just have failed to follow that advice. But then when I started looking at the government's data on the government's best available data on this, I found that really in every food category, every bit of data I could find shows that Americans have actually followed the guidelines. Red meat down by 28%. Grains are up by 40%. We eat much more fruits and vegetables than we did in 1970. By 20 or 30% in each category, we eat more of those. We've increased fish. We've increased nuts. We've lowered animal fats by 17% since 1970. Butter is down. I mean, everything we've just done everything right. We lowered saturated fats by 17% in the last few decades. We increased carbohydrates by 30% since 1970. Since 1965. So, I mean, these are big, huge changes that we made, and we made them successfully. We have been pretty obedient in following the guidelines.
Right.
And now we're told it's our fault that we're fat and sick. But, I think a much more plausible explanation is that our guidelines have fueled those epidemics.
Well, not only that, it's transformed the food industry into making foods that complied with that originally. Obviously, there's things like palatability that are concerns, but when your goal is to remove things like saturated fat and put grains into food and make them shelf stable, you're going to have a lot of stuff that doesn't look a whole lot like food. Yeah.
Well, and it happens in many levels. So, like, all cattle in America have been bred to be leaner. All pork has been bred to be leaner. All dairy became low fat. And one of the things about fat is that fat is really what transmits texture and flavor and gives kind of shelf stability to products so they can last. And so what happens when you make low-fat foods, you can't use the fat. So what you have to use is what's called a fat lacer in the food manufacturing business. And that is almost always some kind of carbohydrates, usually just sugar. So that's why, your low-fat salad dressing, your low-fat yogurt, your low-fat ketchup, all of that is just higher in sugar. So we get all these low-fat products. And the USDA was actively telling the food industry, we need thousands more low-fat products.
Right.
And so that's what we got. And,
not only that, but fat is also a nutrient delivery mechanism. And so you take that away, then what happens? You get less nutrients. Right.
All the fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, they come through. You need the fat to deliver those to you. So, if you're having fat-free milk, you're not getting the vitamins in the milk. And if you're not getting the vitamins, it's harder to absorb the other nutrients in milk, minerals.
Right. And a lot of these things coexist in the actual food. And if they're isolated, they can actually cause damaging effects. I had another guest on the podcast, Norgid Gaudas, and she was talking about how if you have just vitamin D in isolation, well, it's great at depositing calcium, but doesn't really know what to do with that and can put that into arteries unless you have that with vitamin K, and unless you have that in a vitamin K form that comes from animal products only. And so if you're removing all this fat and trying to put in back the nutrients, it's not going to work very well.
But that's our system, right? Our system is we fortify and enrich refined grains with iron and folate and B12, and we're told to get those nutrients by eating refined grains. That's our current policy. And not to get them in their natural, more bioavailable, in other words, your body's more able to absorb them form, which is in where they naturally occur. Those occur in B12 is only in animal foods. Iron, folate is in mainly in meat. So, you can eat a room full of spinach and you can get the same amount of iron availability as eating a piece of meat.
Right. And so that goes to, this is a big point here, is that even in plants, even if it isn't fortified foods, even if it is in growing vegetables, your body cannot assimilate the same amount of nutrients as it can from animal products. And a lot of those nutrients come in the fat of those animal products.
Right. And they need the fat of those animal products to be absorbed.
Right.
And
so yeah. How did you feel a shift, and why did you switch from being a vegetarian to eating meat eater? What was your point of view originally? Was it just to follow the generic advice to be healthy at that point? And what kind of made you switch to eating meat and fatty? Was it your research for this book?
Yeah. So originally I followed a kind of vegetarian low-fat diet because I thought that was the best way to stay thin.
Did it work?
I started it when I was like in my late teens, and no, I was like always a chubby young woman, always struggling with my weight, always exercising a ton, but just unable to drop weight. And it's not like being diabetic. I really feel for people who have true serious diseases, but being a chubby young woman when you're a young woman, is like has its own form of devastation. But what changed me was that it was actually this at first. What changed me was that I got this restaurant review column that was sort of just given to me. It was a little throwaway paper, and I went around and reviewed restaurants and wrote them up, and we had no budget to pay for meals, so I had to give whatever the chef decided to send out to me. Well, I would go into the restaurant and say, "Oh, I'd like your stir-fried vegetables," because that's what I would normally eat, or chicken breast without the skin. And the chefs were horrified. They said, this does not feature our cooking talent. So they sent me out whatever they wanted to, and that turned out to be, foie gras and red meat and cream sauce and all these earthy, dense textured dishes that I hadn't eaten red meat in so long. So I found them kind of interesting and tasty, and especially, they were much higher in fat than anything I'd eaten. And so then all of a sudden I dropped 10 pounds, which I just didn't understand at all. And went to the doctor, and he says, "Look, wow, your cholesterol levels look actually better than they normally do." So that was just a complete mystery to me. I was doing everything wrong, yet I felt and looked better. So, and then that was also coincided with the beginning of the research into my book, and really the process of researching my book and sort of gradually seeing how scientists had really lied about the science and their data, and papers where the conclusions don't even reflect anything to do with the data. I mean, real distortions of the data in the field seemed so thoroughly rotten that so gradually I just changed my mind about what I thought was a healthy diet. I know there are some people I've talked to over the years who just say from one day to the next, they're like, oh, I get it. Now I'm switching. But for me, it was a very slow and gradual process because it takes a while to be convinced that something so different can be right.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
An interesting point you made was that it was presumably were you in New York when you were getting fed by these chefs?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm sure they were at higher end places and like really classically trained chefs.
Right.
There's a lot of
exactly.
Yeah. There's a lot of intuition from cooking from like really high end places that comes down the line from generation after generation after generation that I think we've lost in obviously the food industry when you go to the grocery store. But that's kind of an interesting thing that's held for high-end chefs to make really good food. You use really good ingredients and a lot of fat. And that's what keeps us healthy and really delivers a lot of nutrients. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you say there. I mean, one thing is in talking to chefs, I mean, it's been so interesting to me to realize like how important fat is for cooking, that to make things tasty, it's very hard to make something tasty if you don't have the fat, and that, for throughout the, the height of the non-fat 1980s, chefs really were exhorted not to use any fat, and there was almost just a crisis among chefs about how to make tasty food. If you're trying to use banana puree instead of for cream, it was really, really difficult for them, for many, and for people in the U.S. And as you say, the classic training is cream sauce. French training is it's all based in fats. And I think one of the things that was also an interesting insight for me was how, because America is a nation of immigrants, we are disconnected from our own food traditions differently than the way they are in other parts of the world, where they still, their grandmother is nearby, or they they're rooted in their food traditions. Whereas in America, we've lost that, and we're disconnected from our past. And so we turned out, I think, to be much more susceptible to the kind of advertising campaigns that went on chiefly in women's magazines, Cosmo and all these magazines that were funded by the food industry to create a new idea about what was good food. And, we didn't have our grandmothers there looking over our shoulder and saying, what, you're putting Campbell's soup mushrooms on chicken? We don't do that.
Right.
But, when you go to other countries, like I just recently traveled to Mexico, and, there's such a different attitude towards food. They're really attached to their food because it's part of their culture. And so, we've been deprived of that, I think, here.
Have you noticed much of a shift in things like the magazines now, maybe since, people like Gary Taubes have been coming out with a lot of information. You've done a really, really good job about this too. And I think that, having this big force of the ketogenic diet becoming popular, have you noticed a shift in public perception of fat?
Well, definitely there. I believe we're in a moment of paradigm shift on fat. We have, here's something that probably none of your listeners know, but there is no more low fat diet recommendation. So if you go to, USDA dietary guidelines site, or you go to the American Heart Association, they're and those are the main groups giving out dietary recommendations that are followed by everybody else. If you go search low fat, it is not there. They have basically tiptoed away from their low fat diet recommendations because, as I told you, that trial on 49,000 women couldn't show any health benefits. But they've done it so quietly that, it's taking a long time for this to, there was no public announcement about it. So it's taking a long time for that to disseminate out among the public.
Did anything replace that? Or was it just removal of that and then still high grain and everything? Did anything shift?
Yeah, no. They didn't say. What they'll say is like, now it's okay to have avocados and olives.
Okay.
And, we're allowed to eat a little more fat, but still keep those grains and fruits and vegetables up. So it's a little, schizophrenic. But I think that the more intractable issue is the one on saturated fats, which is, what my work has been about. And I know that there has been a tremendous sea change since 2014 when my book came out, and also a very important study came out that was exonerated saturated fats. However, the press is still pretty hostile to this science. And that is because the press is largely very much taken by the vegetarian idea. And saturated fats have always been the rate limiting factor on how much meat people eat. And the vegetarian leaning press, I think, really does not want to let meat on the table.
Why do you think
at least that's just my theory.
From their own propaganda and dogma that they're holding so tightly to their chest, or what?
There are many reasons people are vegetarians. A lot of people think it's the best diet for health, even though there's no randomized controlled clinical trial to demonstrate that. So there's really no rigorous evidence for it. But there are other people who, they're animal welfare activists. There are people who believe that it's the best for the environment. I think that's also a claim that has weak science behind it. But there are a number of reasons. Also, a number of these groups are supported by grain industry, one of the largest think tanks in the food tank in George Washington University. Its main sponsor is Barilla Pasta. They do a lot of vegetarian leaning. I mean, it's just everywhere. And then there's these long time, very powerful diet doctors, like Dean Ornish, and they're just whole diet empires that really depend upon this vegetarian idea. So I think that the press has been largely won over by that idea. I see it in the progressive media, at least. I see that very strongly.
Right. How did you feel besides, it sounded like effortless weight loss, fat loss, when you started shifting the way you ate? Were there any other health benefits or any other benefits in general that you noticed from switching back to a higher fat and, incorporating saturated fats in your diet?
Yes. And, I know this is just anecdotal, but I've heard it from other people too. So one of the things that mysteriously happened to me is that I stopped getting sinus infections, which had plagued me every winter. And I'd had surgery to treat them. And all of a sudden, I have to knock on wood here. I haven't had one in many, many years now. And who knew that could be related to diet? I also have more energy. I'm not tired in the middle of the afternoon. I don't need as much sleep. I used to get acne. I don't get any acne anymore. That could just be getting older. But I feel incredibly strong and healthy in a way that is really unlike anything that I felt as a young woman. I'd give anything to feel like this when I was in my 20s.
Right. So, question, what do you eat on a day-to-day basis now?
Well, I usually don't eat before noon.
Is that just because of hunger levels, or is that intentional, habitual?
Yeah, I'm just not that hungry. And then I've also just decided that this intermittent fasting thing of, the idea is that you restrict your exposure so that you don't have an insulin effect going on. You kind of give your body a break from its exposure to insulin. And that helps you with weight loss and or weight maintenance. And then I eat. Usually, I just heat up leftovers from the dinner from the night before, which is, I have meat, cheese, chicken. I have vegetables. I have a pretty simple diet. I don't eat much fruit other than berries. I just have a kind of boring diet, I have to say, but I find it very easy, and I don't get hungry, and I don't worry about counting calories. That's the most liberating thing in the whole world. You just don't worry about counting calories.
Right. Because when you eat nutrient dense, high amounts of real food, your body gets what it needs, and it tells you that it's full and you're satisfied. You don't have to always have these crazy hunger signals going on. Yes.
And then if you're not having if you don't have many carbohydrates in your diet, which I don't, then you aren't, carbohydrates cause that glucose spike in your blood, and then it plummets, and then you feel a need to kind of refuel your glucose. So I just keep carbohydrates really low. I don't eat bread. I don't eat pasta. I don't eat rice. I have, sometimes I have potatoes, but it's just not a major staple in my diet.
So are you in a state of ketosis often? Do you just not check or care? You just feel good with what you're doing?
For a while, I did check my ketones a lot. And I did that over a period where I was trying to figure out what spiked my blood sugar. Like, do these protein bars do it? Or what put me out of ketosis? Or what would spike my blood sugar and get me out of ketosis? It turns out, like, I really couldn't have as much fruit as I thought I could. And so for a while, paying really close attention helped me understand how my body responded to food. And then I didn't want to think about it anymore. Like, I find obsessing about food. I know some people can keep food diaries and journals and chart it every day. Like, I really can't do that.
Right. And like you said,
I can't. I'm not interested enough, and I also don't have time.
Well, once you learn from it and learn like the big ticket items, you don't need to do that stuff anymore. And so that's why I always recommend like testing up front to see like, okay, this is how this works. This is how my body responds as an individual. These are the things that, shoot my blood sugar up, which might be different from somebody else. Some people might handle food well. Who knows? So until you do that yourself, you're not going to know. But once you know, you have a pretty good idea how to move forward.
Right. And so now there are these continual glucose monitors where you can, I don't know how it works, but but apparently they're just real game changers where you can see immediately how your glucose level is reacting to whatever you eat. And that's what I would do now if I were doing this. I mean, one tip I would give for people who do want to figure out how their bodies are working, which is just invest in those ketone strips and test yourself like 5 times a day, even though that's expensive and what put me off it for quite a while. But like doing it once a day is not that helpful. What you really want to do is see how your body is reacting, meal to meal. And when I finally did that, that's what helped me really chart and understand how my body is reacting to food.
Yeah. And if you really can't afford them, even a glucose monitor, where you have the strips, much cheaper, can give you a pretty good idea too. So like if you, let's say, eat a meal and test at that point, and then every 15 minutes for about an hour and a half, then you can kind of see a curve, which is the most helpful thing when you have these continuous glucose monitors. Then you can say like, okay, my blood sugar normalized. It didn't spike that much after eating an apple, but it did a lot after banana. I should not eat bananas. And then you can just move on from that and then test something new. And in general, like, I don't know, I'm pretty boring too. Like I eat pretty similar when I'm in a routine and when I'm not traveling. And it's not that hard for me to be like, okay, these are like the 15, 20 foods that I eat. Let's test them out. And then if I add something new, I can do that and not have to be so crazy about it.
Yeah. I mean, like if you're stuck, and for a while I was stuck, I gained quite a bit of weight writing my book. I had many endless late nights. I had a lot of stress. I gained, maybe 10 pounds and I was stuck. And so it took me a while to figure it out. And also for the women in your audience who are listening, I mean, of a certain age, you also need to pay attention to hormones. And ultimately for me, that turned out to be part of the solution, which is that if your hormones are changing at a certain point in life, that does have an effect on your weight. So that's something worth paying attention to.
So are you as stressed out nowadays?
I'm always stressed out. I'm stressed out, but it doesn't affect my weight, so it's okay.
And so you're not doing another book, but we chatted a little bit before the show during the show about the nutritional guidelines, and I think what you're doing with work now is super fascinating in trying to shift that with actual evidence. Can you just touch on that?
Yes. So when my book came out, I thought, the scales will fall from everybody's eyes, and that's it. Everybody will change their policy. But it turns out that didn't happen overnight. And then upon doing quite a bit more research, I realized that the most important policy in shaping the food supply and what people think is a healthy diet is these U.S. dietary guidelines that we talked about. I started to focus on them because it turns out that they control really everything that goes on. The school lunch programs, what your elderly parent gets fed in a nursing home, what you get fed when you go to the hospital, military rations, and they're basically downloaded by all the healthcare associations. So anybody working on the front line of healthcare if you're doctor, nutritionist, dietitian, nurse, they are all telling you what the guidelines, and they're required to tell you the guidelines. So some doctors tell me, I'd like to tell people about a low carb diet, but in my medical practice, we can't because they fear, in my medical practice, we fear medical malpractice suits if we tell people anything but the guidelines. So I came to realize how important they were. Like, even though people don't go looking to a .gov website for their diet advice, that advice finds them wherever they are. So I thought, we have to change them because they are not. Well, first I did a kind of a complete analysis of all the studies they had ever used to make the guidelines, and this was published in a cover story in the British Medical Journal, for which I was roundly punished by having 180 scientists try to get that article retracted, which was a saga that went on for over a year, and the BMJ ended up standing by the article, so it is not retracted. But that's how I found out that that none of the experts producing the guidelines had ever reviewed any of those clinical trials that I've talked about. The one in 49,000 women, not in the guidelines. The results are not in the guidelines. So I started this group called the Nutrition Coalition. It's an educational group, and it's in Washington, D.C., and our goal is to try to get guidelines that are evidence-based. Our goal is to say, look, you must consider the randomized controlled clinical trial evidence that exists out there. That's the rigorous evidence. We want guidelines based on that evidence. We don't want guidelines based on that weak epidemiological evidence, which is what we have currently. So that would seem like an easy fix. But again, it's really hard because pretty much, there's just a monolith of powers lined up against us, right? Right. Big Pharma does not want a healthy America. The American Heart Association, all the public health groups, the entire U.S. government. I mean, there's a great resistance to change. But really, all we're saying is we're not for any particular diet. We're not saying this is good or that is good. We're just saying have guidelines based on rigorous evidence. Right. So that's what that's what I'm really devoting my time to now. And if anybody wants to learn more, I'm just going to throw out that website. It's Nutrition Coalition, one word, .us. So that's the website you can go to learn more about what we're doing.
It's amazing. And one of the things too is that it's not just saturated fat. That's the admission here. It's not just high grains. Like, there are a lot of different things in this that I'm sure you could touch on hundreds of different topics. Like salt, for instance. I was reading on your website your article on the DASH studies. There's tons of these things that we just have wrong. And like you said, when it comes from the top, it truly is a trickle down system in this regard. But thank you very much for doing the work and trying to fix that. It's a very high leverage point.
Well, thank you. And to your readers who are interested, I thank them in advance. And you're right. So much of our what typically happens is like some hypothesis idea becomes codified as policy. Salt is another example. It's not true that lower is better. And only hypertensive middle-aged adults have ever been tested on that advice, which is now being rolled out to children in schools and everywhere. So another non-evidence-based bit of advice that actually the evidence shows is probably harming people. Like that is, once it becomes codified in policy, it's very hard to reverse out of. But it just has to happen because, when you look at the health of our nation and the cost of all of those diseases, the suffering, the economic costs, like that just has to change. It's just not sustainable for any of us. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Well, we appreciate it. So I know we could go on this other stuff forever. So people can find, obviously, your work at nutritioncoalition.us. Anywhere else that you want to send folks?
Well, my own website is just ninateichholz.com. And that's where you can also find other work that I've done, newspaper articles and stuff. And please buy my book. It really is, my favorite description of it is as a nutrition thriller, which is what The Economist called it, because it does tell the whole story. Like the personality, the politics, and the players. It is just a rip-roaring, amazing story of how we got our nutrition policy wrong. That's basically it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nina.
Thank you for having me. It's really been great talking to you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.